Now that you've actually added hair to your scene, it's time to go into the Attributes Manager and start looking at what each one of these tabs is going to allow us to do with the hair. The first tab, and probably the most important when you're working with hair, is the Guides tab. Now, a guide is what you see here in the viewport, these blue lines. And these are essentially going to be guides to tell Cinema 4D where it should be putting hair. So the best way to kind of visualize what you're seeing here is to see each one of these blue lines as a strand of hair. And then at render time, there is going to be an actual strand of hair placed in between all of these blue lines to kind of fill in the gaps. Another way of looking at this is if you're familiar with the loft NURBS, you have to put in several spline profiles and it kind of blends between those profiles. This is very similar to that process where you're essentially creating a set of hairs in between these two guides, and it blends between the two guides, except it's doing that across the entire surface. So the Guides tab is what is going to allow us to control how these guides are placed along the surface. The first parameter here is a link field, and as you saw in the adding hair tutorials, this is essentially going to tell the guides which object it is supposed to grow on. You'll see if we twirl this down, we can get the attributes for the object that it's attached to, but that's not really that important. More important is just the name. So as with every link field in Cinema, you do have an option to pick session. You can also clear the link. So you'll see if we do that, the hair guides don't disappear, but we do get these little green circles, and we'll get into that later on. But essentially, what those mean is that the hairs are no longer attached to an object, because there's no link. So I'm just going to undo. So we have those connected again, and we'll keep looking at our options. We also have the Show in Manager and Select Element, just so we can easily select that object if we wanted to. The first subsection that we have is Roots. And essentially what this field is telling us is how many guides we're going to see. So a root is more or less the guide. In this case, the count is set to 170. And this is being driven by the root type. And we'll get to that in just a second. The length is the overall length of the guide. So you'll see if we adjust the slider, we can change the general height of our hair. Segments is going to be the number of divisions along this guide. And really the best way to show segments is to quickly show you a guide that is not perfectly straight. So here in the editor we can see that we have a curved guide now. And when you're looking at the guide, you can see that there are definitely some divisions in there. If we change the number of segments to something lower, you'll see that the segments on this guide are much more apparent. These segments are going to be very important when you get into doing things like simulations with your hair. Now simulations do have the option of running off the hair itself or off the guides, and depending on which one you choose, you may need more detail or more segments in the guides or in the hair itself. The next attribute we have here is a drop-down for root, and this is going to tell Cinema where it should place guides on the object that we have in the link field. By default, we have polygon vertex. And what this does is it looks at every vertex that is on your object, and it's going to place a guide at that vertex. This is the reason that the count is currently set at 170. Now, we can decrease this number to remove guides, but we can't go beyond the number of points on our object. So the first thing that we're going to do before we switch the root type is to change the map. And don't worry about what this does yet, we will come back to it. So with the map changed, we're going to set the root to polygon. And you'll see that the viewport updates. What Cinema is now doing is taking these 170 roots that we have and trying to distribute those along the polygons in the object. It is doing its best to keep an even number of guides in each polygon. So if you have a very evenly divided object that you're adding the hair to, this could work very well. Where it does have downsides is in areas where you have smaller polygons. And you'll see that it looks like we get a lot more guides in these areas because it's just taking the same number of guides and putting them in a smaller area. So where a large polygon here might have 2 guides, a small polygon with 2 guides looks very dense. For the best distribution across a surface, you will probably want to use the polygon area. And what this does is just takes those 170 roots again, and it's going to spread them evenly across the entire surface. Now, with both the polygon area and the polygon mode, you are able to change the number of counts beyond the number of points or polygons on your object. Now, you would think that this would be enough options for anybody to get hair or the guides to create the hair on their object. But since we really love options, we also have the option of setting the polygon center. So much like with the vertex, there is a maximum count of guides that we can have because there are only so many centers to our polygons. And you'll see all it's doing is placing a guide at the center of each polygon in our object. Next, we have the polygon edge. And what this guy is doing is just distributing the guides along the polygon edges. The distribution in this case can go beyond the number of edges, as it's just randomly filling guides along the edges here. We then have a couple of options called UV and UV grid, and these two options are going to work with the UV map associated with your object. We'll start with UV. The first thing you should notice is that nothing happened in the viewport, so it didn't update, and that's because the object that we currently have the hair applied to does not have a UVW tag. So we're going to add a tag quickly. In the Materials Manager, just double-click to create a new material, drag the material onto the pelt. From here you can switch to the Texture Axis tool, and you'll see that we get a sphere, which is not really what we want. So in the Attributes Manager we can change the projection to flat. And we'll just rotate this to 90 degrees so it lies flat along our surface. Then with the tag selected, we'll go to the Tags menu and choose Fit to Object. And this just makes it so that our flat projection is scaled to fit the bounding box of whatever object we had selected. From here, you can go to the Tags menu again and choose Generate UVW Coordinates. And what this does is takes whatever projection you have in your texture tag and generates a UVW tag with those same mapping coordinates. So now that we have that added, you'll see that the projection type in our texture tag has switched to UVW mapping from the flat mapping, and this means that we now have UVW coordinates. We'll go back to the model tool, and you'll see that the hair still hasn't updated. So we can click back on the hair object, and we're just going to click on the Update Guides button, and this will force a refresh of the hair object. At this point you'll see that the guides do update in the viewport, and what we have are the 711 guides distributed across the surface. So how exactly is this distribution figured out though? The best way to look at that is to go to the Window menu and then choose New Texture View. And this will open up a new texture window. At this point we can select the pelt, and then in the texture window choose Show UV Mesh. This shows you the UV mesh that the hair is being generated off. Now what you'll have to do is imagine that in this square we have 711 points that are randomly scattered all across the square. If one of those points happens to land on a polygon in this square here, then it will create a guide that would correspond to the position on the polygon. So if we kind of line these up here, maybe zoom in a bit, any hairs that are on this polygon right here are corresponding to any hairs that may fall in the area that we see right here. What this means is if you change the layout of your UV polygons here, it's going to reflect in the way that your guides are distributed along the surface in the viewport. So if we quickly go to the Body Paint 3D menu, and then choose the Tools, UV Polygons, and we can go in here and select some polygons. And actually, let's go from the top portion that we're actually looking at. We can now move these polygons, and we can scale them up. And if we need to, we can go to the UV Tools Non-Uniform Scale. This selection of polygons here now takes up a lot more space on the UV tile. Going back to the hair, we can click Update Guides again. Let's just go back to the model tool here. And this really demonstrates how the guides are being distributed amongst the polygons here. Since the portion that we just stretched out takes up more space on this tile, it gets allocated more hairs, since there's more tiny little dots falling on those polygons. Now, where the UV polygons land on the tile is also very important. The whole system really depends on being inside this first tile. If we go back to the UV tools and choose the UV polygons, you'll see if we move these off to the side, then click back on the hair and update the guides again, we do not get any guides on the section that is not inside that first tile. The other thing that happens is with overlapping polygons. So these are overlapping here, and if we update the guides, you'll see that it's trying to divide the number of guides between this surface, which we're seeing right here, and also the head. So they're kind of stealing from each other. If you didn't want this to happen, you would have to make sure that you adjust the sizes of these two UV islands so that they still fit within this square, but they are not overlapping. So let's just undo a couple times so that we have the UV map before we stretched that portion out. We can go to the hair and update guides just to make sure that that is nice and laid out smoothly again. The next option is UV grid. And at first we see a slight update in the viewport, but there isn't a whole lot of difference between this and the UV mode. So what exactly is this doing? Well, going to the texture window, what we have to imagine is a grid that is drawn over top of this UV tile. And this could be in the U direction or in the V direction. Now, wherever these grid points intersect, it's going to create a little place where guides should grow. So if we take a look at the Attributes Manager, we can see that we have some controls here for how this is working. The first thing we'll do is start by turning the variation down. So with the variation set to 0%, you can now see in the viewport, and if we go to the top view you'll see this better, that we more or less have a grid of points that are laid out across this object based on the UV tile that we see here. So in UV space, we have the U direction, which is from left to right, and we can adjust that with the U spacing. So you'll see that smaller values give me more divisions going from left to right. Larger values give me less divisions. So in this case, 50% would give me from left to right 0%, 50%, and 100%. So we get a set of lines going right down the middle. Then as we go down from there, that is going to adjust where the grid is located. The same thing applies for the V spacing, which is the spacing of these grid lines from the top to bottom. So again, if we just choose 50%, we'll go from the bottom 0%, 50%, and then 100 is up here. Next, along both these axes, we have variation that we can add. So we can add variation on the distribution of these guides from left to right. And we do that by adjusting the U variation. And you'll see that adjusting the variation almost gives us grid lines. So we can adjust the U variation, and we can adjust the V variation. When we add variation to both directions, it's pretty much just scattering the guides based on the general grid that we laid out and then the U variation values here. The one thing to watch out for is if you have 0 variation on your guides, you still are taking these 711 routes or guides, and you're placing them at these very specific points. So each one of these points contains many guides now. And this could possibly look weird when it comes to render time, as the hair is going to have to try to interpolate between all those clustered guides. The final type of route that we have here is custom. And you'll notice once again when we switch to custom, this is another one of those ones where nothing really changes at first. One thing to note is that the count is grayed out. So you have no way to control the count via a slider. And that's because when you are using the custom route type, it's for when you want to add guides to your object manually. Now that's not something we're going to cover yet, but once we get into the editing tools, we will be able to cover how to add guides manually. The final attribute we're going to take a look at is the map attribute. Now the first thing that we do have to cover here is that this attribute is really only going to have an effect if you have edited your guides. The best way to show this is with the old map setting. Now old should try to maintain these guides as you see them in the viewport. Since we haven't edited any of the guides, what's going to happen when we choose a different setting here for the route is the guides are going to shift positions. So we can undo that, and what we'll do before we start going over the parameter is just go to the simulation menu, choose hair tools, and then brush. And what we're going to do is just click and drag over some of these points to adjust them, and that will be enough to get the map attribute to work correctly. Going back to the hair object, we can now go to the map setting, and it's set to old. Like I had mentioned, the old map setting is going to try to maintain the current guides that we have when we change the route. So if we change from polygon vertex to polygon, you'll see that the routes don't change at all, and this allows us to maintain any styling that we have created. If I change the count, I can now increase the number of guides that we see on the object, and I can decrease those as well. As soon as I switch this back to something like polygon vertex, you'll see that I don't really get an update. And that's because it's trying to maintain the original count of 72. I can bring this back up until I get to my max count and fill everything out. The other option would be to regrow the hairs, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The next option that we have under map is new. And what new will do is recalculate the position of the guides while still trying to maintain more or less the styling that we have there. So if I go to polygon, you'll see that the guides change quite a lot, but the general styling that we can see has not changed. Switching to polygon area, again you'll see that all the guides change position quite heavily, but the general styling is still kind of there. So the new mapping option doesn't try to maintain the old positions of guides, but it does try to maintain a little bit of the styling. Now, if you are looking to maintain any of the style that you have created, the new option is probably not the best option for you. So the last option is unroot. And where it really comes into play is when you start editing the actual mesh while you have styled hair. So with the new or old map option selected here, you can go into your polygon object and do something like add a knife cut. And you'll see that with new selected, it did update the guides a little bit there, just to accommodate the new geometry that I added. And it tries to do this because I currently have the route set to polygon as well. If I go to old, I can make the same cut, and it's mostly just going to try to maintain the positions of all the hairs regardless of the geometry I added. For unroots, I could also add the cut, but that's not really where you're going to see the benefit. Where you are going to see the benefits here is, let's say if we have old, and we go to the polygon and we delete these points, you'll see that the hair disappears. If I go to new and try the same thing, you'll see that the hair disappears again, so it is only linking to the points that we can see directly. Finally, if I go to unroot and then delete these points, you'll see that the hair is left floating in space. And so what we have here are unrooted hairs. And if we go to the hair object, you'll see that they have the little green circle at their base saying that they're unrooted. So even though they have no object to follow, the hair guides are still left there so that we do have a reference.